Yes, guys. So while we discussed about the concepts of recognition and measurement in the books of lessee, we first discussed about the important paragraphs which talk about the definition of specific terms. So let us start with illustrations which are related to those specific terms on determination what is an inception or the commencement of lease. How do we define a lease term and determine what is a lease term? What are the lease payments to be included and what are the lease payments to be excluded in measurement of lease? So these are the three most important things. Apart from this, we have also seen involvement of lessee before the lease has commenced. We have seen lease incentives and initial direct cost. So all the questions related to these topics, together with initial recognition and subsequent recognition in the books of lessee, let's try to solve questions relating to them. I will start with the first question, that is question number 15 here. It deals with determination of lease term. Under scenario A, entity ABC enters into a lease for an equipment which includes a non-cancellable lease term of 6 years. 6 years definitely to be included in the lease term, and an additional 2 years fixed price renewal option with future lease payments that are intended to be approximately the market price at the lease inception. There is no termination penalties and other factors indicating that entity ABC is reasonably certain to exercise the renewal option. There is no penalties and other factors indicating that ABC is reasonably certain to exercise a renewal option. So therefore, it is not reasonable certain. What is your lease term? Look at scenario B. XYZ enters into a lease of a building that includes a non-cancellable period of 8 years and a 2 years market price renewal option. Before it takes possession of the building, XYZ pays for leasehold improvements. The leasehold improvements are expected to have significant value at the end of 8 years, and the value can be realized only through continued occupancy in the leased property. Therefore, it is reasonably certain that the lessee will extend the lease, and therefore even those 2 years should be included, and hence the lease term should be considered as 10 years. PQR entity enters into a lease for an identified retail space in a shopping center. The retail space is available to PQR only for the month of October, November, December during a non-cancellable term of 7 years. 3 months for 7 years, 21 months is the total lease term. The lessor agreed to provide the same retail space for each of those 7 years. That means there is an identified asset and the non-cancellable period is 3 months spread over 7 years. So the lease term should only be considered as 21 months. Clear? So looking at these three scenarios, let us answer what is lease term. But before that, I would start the answer by defining what is a lease term. Without defining a lease term, I don't think so it is appropriate for us to start the answer. So at least for the first time, let us write what is a lease term. Put heading as lease term. What does lease term include? Lease term includes 3 parts. First part, a non-cancellable period. For which the contract conveys a right to use of an identified asset to the customer or the lessee. You can call him as a customer or you can call him as a lessee. So a non-cancellable period for which the lessee or the contract conveys a right to use the asset, an identified asset, to the customer or the lessee, together with plus a period covered under extension option if, only if, it is reasonably certain at the inception of lease that the lessee or the customer will exercise his option of extension is reasonably certain that the lessee will exercise his extension option at the end of lease term. Third one, the period covered under termination option when do I add termination option lease term? If it is not reasonably certain that the lessee will exercise his option of extension these 3 points combined will define what is a lease term. So non-cancelable period of lease together with added with the period of extension together with added with the period of termination. These 3 points together are inclusions in lease term. Correct? All 3 points are right now visible to you. Now, these 3 points together will determine what is a lease term in a particular lease contract. So, in a contract to define lease term, we'll have to consider all these 3. Now, keeping this in consideration, let's read the question again in scenario A, B and C and determine what is a lease term in each of those scenarios. First, I'll begin with scenario A. ABC enters into a lease for equipment that indicates a non-cancelable lease term of 6 years and a 2 years fixed price renewal option with further lease payments that are intended to be approximately the market values at the lease inception. There is no termination penalties and no other factors indicating that the ABC Limited is reasonably certain to exercise the renewal option. Then what is a lease term? It is not reasonably certain that ABC will exercise the renewal option and there is no termination penalty. Therefore, the lease term should only be considered as non-cancelable period, that is 6 years. So let us write down. First, put a heading as scenario A and answer it. Scenario A. Under scenario A, first write your conclusion. Lease term is equal to 6 years. Why did you consider it as 6 years and why you did not consider the 2 years? Write that reason below. The period covered under extension option how much was the period covered under extension option? 2 more years. It cannot be included in lease term. Cannot be included in lease term since it is not reasonably certain that the lessee will exercise the option of renewal since it is not reasonably certain that the lessee will exercise his option of renewal. The lease term should only be limited to 6 years, cannot include the other 2 years period which is included under the extension option or renewal option. Clear? Now let's start looking at the next part, that is scenario B. Look at scenario B now. Under scenario B, XYZ enters into a lease of a building for a non-cancellable period of 8 years and 2 years on market price renewal option. Before it takes possession of the building, XYZ pays lease improvements. The lease improvements are expected to have a significant value even at the end of 8th year. Therefore, the value can be realized only through continued occupancy of the lease property. Then what is the lease term? Guys, since you are not able to realize the entire value of the lease improvements even at the end of 8th year, it becomes reasonably certain that the lessee will extend his lease option. Write down scenario B. Lease term is equal to 10 years. 8 years non-cancellable period plus 2 years covered under extension option. Write down. Period covered under extension option is reasonably certain to be exercised. Why is it reasonably certain to be exercised? Since the lessee can realize benefits from leasehold improvements only if the lease term is extended. Why did you say that? Because the question clearly stated that even at the end of 8 years, the leasehold improvements will have significant value and they can only be realized by extending the lease towards the renewal option, that is 2 years, making the total lease term as 10 years. Now let's look at scenario C. The period for which an asset has been given to the lessee should be considered as lease term. Look at it. PQR enters into a lease of an identified retail space in a shopping center. The retail space will be available to entity PQR only during the month of October, November and December during a non-cancellable period of 7 years. the lessee agrees to provide the same retail space for each of those 7 years, then what is your lease term? Write down. Under scenario C, lease term is equal to 7 years into 3 months every year. That will give me 21 months as the total lease term. Because since the lessee acquires a right to use the asset, only for 3 months each year over 7 years of the period of contract. So though it is 7 years covered under the period of contract, since he has a right to use the asset only for 3 months, I'll have to consider that the lease term is only for 21 months. Yes, guys. So let's move on to the next question then. Reassessment of exercising the lease extension option. Retailer M enters into a 5-year lease for a building, followed by 2 successive 5-year renewal option. 2 successive 5-year renewal option. Initially 5 years, 2 successive 5-year renewal option. That means if the option can be exercised, if it is reasonably certain that the lessee will exercise the extension option, then you will find that the total lease term being 15 years. Whenever you make a reassessment of the exercise of lease extension, you will have to reassess and remeasure the lease liability as well. On the commencement date, retailer M is not reasonably certain to exercise the renewal option. At the end of 3rd year, entity M extended to include another floor from year 4 due to business acquisition. For this purpose, the lease concludes a separate 7 years of the additional floor of the building already leased. Is retailer M required to reassess the lease term in this case? Absolutely yes. Why? Because you are taking an additional asset, and such additional asset is provided for a further lease of 7 years. Then look at it, the original lease was only for 5 years, but this new lease of the additional 4 entered into at the end of 3 years has a further 7 years to run, and both the floors of building are interrelated to each other. Therefore, the lease term of the original building floor is also reasonable to be extended for another 5 years period. So let's start writing it down. Question number 15. Lease term is initially assessed as 5 years, since it is not reasonably certain that the lessee will extend the lease. Will extend the lease. However, the lease term should be reassessed. Reassessed as 10 years at the end of year 3. At the end of year 3. Why did you do so? Since the lessee has entered into a lease modification since you have entered, it is called as a lease modification because he is including an additional asset. To include an additional building floor. An additional building floor. Which has a lease term of 7 years. Therefore, it is reasonably certain. It is reasonably certain that the lessee will exercise the renewal option for original building floor. In the original building floor, it becomes reasonably certain that he will exercise the renewal option. Write myself, please write down. Initially, it was assessed as 5 years, but after you have taken a lease modification to include an additional building floor for a lease term of 7 years. This modification happened at the end of year 3. Therefore, it is reasonably certain that the lessee will exercise renewal option for the original building floor, and therefore the lease term should now be assessed as 10 years and not as 7 years. I am giving you sufficient time so that even if you are a little slow in listening to my explanation and then writing the answer, you will have sufficient time to write down your answers. That is the only reason why I am giving some time at the end of each question. Now that we are done with that part of the question, let's look at the next question. Let's get into question number 17 then. Reassessment of non-cancellable period. Again, reassessment coming up. Guys, whenever there is a reassessment, guys, I would like you people to add one more part here. I would like you people to add one more part in this question. One more part of the answer. In such case, lessee is required to remeasure lease liability using additional cash flows covered under period of renewal. Another 5 years also there is cash flows covered under period of renewal, and the appropriate revised discount rate at the end of year 3. At that point of time, whatever is your discount rate, apply the revised discount rate. Revised discount rate was applicable only in 2 situations. First one, where you have remeasured the lease term because there is a reassessment of the lessee's option to extend the lease. Or second one, where the lessee has an option to acquire the leased asset, and when you reassess whether it is reasonably certain for lessee to acquire the leased asset at the end of lease term, in these 2 situations, you apply a revised discount rate. Remeasure lease liability and apply revised discount rate. You're changing the value of lease liability, it should also in turn change the value of ROU asset. Such change in lease liability should be adjusted to the value of ROU asset. So even the value of ROU asset will change whenever you reassess your lease liability. Correct? So it should be adjusted to the value of ROU asset, which you already recognized. This part also we have discussed. When we talk about reassessment of lease liability. Just repeating it. Now I'll look at question number 17. Company N has taken 10 vehicles on lease for an initial period of 5 years with an extension option at the option of the lessee for a period of 5 more years at the same rental amount. The remaining useful life of the vehicle as on commencement date of the lease is 15 years. Company N has determined at the commencement date that it is reasonably certain to exercise the extension option, and hence it has taken a period of 10 years for the lease. At the end of year 4, there is an announcement by the government that all the cars of that particular model are discontinued from the road within 1 year due to changes in pollution norms of the country. Will the lease term be reassessed? 100% the lease term has to be reassessed. We have already written in the previous one. When do you have to reassess? So I'll apply the same thing and I'll write down under question number 17. Lease term. of vehicles should be reassessed in year 4 and should now be considered as only 4 years, or only 5 years. Why do you do that? Since, write your reason. The revised pollution norms or the new pollution norms restrict the lessee from deriving benefit from the use of asset, the vehicle here, the use of vehicle for a period beyond 5 years. 4 years already done. Another 1 year he will allow. So I cannot derive any benefit from the asset after 5 years term. Therefore, it has to be reassessed, and now the lease term should only be considered as 5 years. You can write the last paragraph again. What was the last paragraph which we have to write? Whenever there is a reassessment of lease term, in such case, remeasure the lease liability using additional cash flows. Here, no additional cash flows. Here, there is a reduction in cash flows covered under the period of renewal. Since the renewal is not reasonably certain, so such cash flows which were initially considered in measurement of lease liability should now reduce the amount of lease liability by applying a revised discount rate at the end of year 4. Whatever reduction in the value of lease liability is there, same amount of reduction, I'll also adjust it to the value of ROU asset. Clear? Let's look at the next question. Now we are done with lease terms, guys. We are getting into lease payments now. We are done with lease terms. We are looking at lease payments. Entity M and lessor A enter into a 10-year lease of an office building for a fixed annual lease payment of 2 lakhs. As per the terms of the agreement, an annual fixed lease payment comprises of 1,70,000 for rent and 30,000 as real estate taxes. What is the fixed lease payments for the purpose of classifying the lease? Guys, this 30,000 rupees is real estate taxes, which is simply reimbursement of amount. It is a non-lease element. Since it is a non-lease element, if the entity M is not applying a practical expedient of including the non-lease elements together with the lease elements and considering it as a single lease contract, it is suggested as per IND AS 116 to exclude this 30,000 which are attributable to the non-lease element, and only 1,70,000 should be included in computation of lease liability and determining the value of ROU asset. Clear? First, tell me what are your inclusions in lease term or lease payments. Better we write that first because that is a revision of our concept. Lease payments include first one, fixed lease payments or fixed lease rentals, variable payments, which are linked to a rate or index. Third one, a guaranteed residual value or the amount for which the lessee can purchase the leased asset. Lessee can purchase leased asset at the end of lease term. Only if it is reasonably certain that the lessee will exercise the option. Finally, penalty for termination of contract if it is not reasonably certain that lessee will extend the lease. So how many points that we have covered? It shall include fixed lease payments, variable lease payments fixed to a rate or an index, guaranteed residual value or the amount which the lessee pays to the lessor to purchase the leased asset at the end of the lease term, if it is reasonably certain that the lessee will exercise his option to purchase the asset, or penalties which are payable to the lessor if the contract is terminated, if it is reasonably certain that the lessee will not extend the lease. If these four are the inclusions, what are your exclusions? It excludes only two exclusions. What are the two exclusions that it has? Variable lease payments which are not linked to a rate or an index, and consideration for non-lease elements in the contract. Non-lease elements in the contract. This is the relevant paragraph where I talk about what are the inclusions and exclusions in lease payments. Now, if I am applying this paragraph in understanding and trying to answer your question number 18, I will hereby say that the total consideration of 2 lakhs, 1,70,000 is for the right of use asset, that is the building, office building. The balance 30,000 which is paid as real estate taxes, they should be considered as a non-lease element. They do not give a right to the lessee to use that particular asset, should be considered as a non-lease element, should be excluded in recognition of a lease liability and ROU asset in the books of lessee unless the lessee opts for a practical expedient to include this non-lease element and recognize it as a single lease contract. If he uses the practical expedient, then you will consider it as 2 lakhs. If I don't use practical expedient, then I'll only calculate your lease liability and ROU asset based on 1,70,000, and that 30,000 will be excluded. Write your answer. $30,000 paid annually as property tax is a non-lease element therefore lease payments is equal to 1,70,000 rupee per annum, based on which I recognize the ROU asset and the lease liability, unless lessee opts for practical expedient. Lessee opts for practical expedient to include non-lease elements and consider it as a single lease contract. And consider it as a single lease contract. Whenever you get this non-lease element, please make sure that you are writing this term of practical expedient. Very, very important in understanding the recognitions in the books of lessee. Automatically, if they opt for practical expedient, your lease payment will become 2 lakhs. Therefore, the value of your leased asset or the ROU asset and the lease liability both are much higher. So it makes a significant difference on whether the lessee actually opts for the practical expedient or does not opt for a practical expedient. Clear? So guys, we have solved significant number of questions so far. We have come down to almost the question number 18. So we'll have further more questions to be discussed, but that I'll park it into the next session. Clear? We are yet to come into the questions regarding recognition and measurement. I'm still discussing about problems related to your lease payments. Clear?